it includes sort of art and some poems and lots of lyrics and discussing and have the commentaries. And I ended up anyway having a lunch with them.
And then, you know, we did very well in England, and then finally we came here, which was sort of where we wanted to do well.
Yeah.
Well, all right.
He's written more classics than most artists could even dream of. He helped shape the sound of an entire generation, crafted melodies that became the soundtrack of people's lives, and built a legacy that still echoes across decades. But behind the charming smile and polite interviews, Paul McCartney has carried a quiet burden for more than 60 years. A list of songs that still make him wince whenever he hears them. The ones that slipped through. The ones that didn't feel right even as the world was falling in love with them. For decades, Paul played the role of the diplomat. Always gracious, always positive, always careful not to tarnish the band's myth. Every Beatles song, he said, had its place. Every experiment had its value, but privately, he knew better. There were songs that haunted him, not because they failed commercially, but because they failed him creatively. Tracks that represented moments when his instincts betrayed him, when perfectionism turned to obsession, and when clever ideas became embarrassing indulgences. These weren't obscure leftovers or forgotten demos. Some were beloved by fans, songs people sang for generations, songs immortalized on albums that critics called masterpieces. And yet, Paul couldn't stand them. He never hated them out of spite, but out of a deep, almost painful awareness that they could have, should have, been better. That somewhere along the way, he'd lost control of his own brilliance. And after a lifetime of protecting the Beatles' sacred image, Paul finally began to open up about those missteps. These are the songs that, if he could turn back time, he'd rather erase from history. One of the first on his list was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. On paper, it was everything people loved about Paul. Playful, melodic, and undeniably catchy. A whimsical tune about a student named Maxwell who kills people with a silver hammer, wrapped in a cheery music hall melody. It was absurd and theatrical, the kind of British quirk that Paul believed would lighten the tension during the Abbey Road sessions. But the problem wasn't the idea, it was the timing. By 1969, the Beatles were falling apart. John wanted raw honesty, George wanted creative respect, Ringo wanted peace, and Paul, desperate to hold everything together, decided to double down on control. Maxwell's Silver Hammer became his obsession. What was supposed to be a quick studio experiment turned into a drawn-out nightmare. Paul pushed everyone to perfect every note, every sound effect, especially the hammer strikes. He even brought a real anvil into Abbey Road, demanding endless takes while the others sat around fuming. John Lennon mocked it, calling it granny music. George and Ringo grew so frustrated that they nearly walked out. Their producer, George Martin, gently tried to move things along, but Paul wouldn't let go. He was determined to prove he was right. Years later, he'd admit that everyone in the studio hated it, and he just kept pushing anyway. "I was being stubborn," he said in hindsight. "I thought I knew better than everyone else in the room." When the song finally made it onto Abbey Road, it sat awkwardly between two of George's masterpieces, Something and Here Comes the Sun. Every time Paul hears the album now, he skips over it. It's not that the song was a disaster, it's polished, well-produced, and has its fans, but it's empty. A gimmick pretending to be clever, a joke that only the Joker finds funny. For Paul, it became a painful reminder that talent means nothing without humility, that sometimes the people who tell you you're wrong are doing you the greatest favor of all. If Maxwell's Silver Hammer taught him a lesson about ego, Wild Honey Pie was the lesson about restraint, or more accurately, about the lack of it. Unlike Maxwell's, this one wasn't even a real song. Wild Honey Pie was born out of boredom. Paul sitting in the studio one night, messing around with his guitar and looping his voice into a bizarre little chant. He was experimenting with early sound layering, having fun with the equipment, never intending for anyone outside the studio to hear it. It was a 30-second joke, a musical doodle that should have died right there on the tape machine. But the White Album was unlike any other record they'd made. By 1968, the band had just returned from India, each Beatle armed with dozens of new ideas, some brilliant, some questionable. They agreed to record almost everything. The White Album became a chaotic democracy where everyone's ideas were welcome, no matter how strange. That meant songs that would have been cut in earlier years suddenly made the final lineup. And somehow, Wild Honey Pie slipped through. It's barely a minute long. There's no melody, no lyrics, no real structure. Just Paul chanting "Honey Pie" over strange guitar riffs and echo effects. It sounds more like a half-remembered dream than a finished track. To Paul, it was nonsense. Fun nonsense, but nonsense nonetheless. When fans later began analyzing it as avant-garde genius or social commentary, Paul could only laugh. "It's not deep," he admitted. "It's just silly." What stung him most wasn't that he made it, but that nobody stopped him. Normally, producer George Martin acted as the band's guiding hand, trimming the excess and shaping their chaos into brilliance.
Out of, I think it's about 300 songs that John and I wrote together, we never had a dry session.
But during the White Album sessions, that control vanished. The Beatles had become their own bosses, and their independence came at a cost. Wild Honey Pie became the musical equivalent of a doodle someone accidentally framed and sold in a gallery. For decades, Paul has cringed whenever the topic comes up. Fans still debate its meaning, calling it experimental or psychedelic humor. But Paul knows better. It wasn't rebellion, it was indulgence. It was proof that creative freedom without boundaries can quickly turn into noise. The track taught him something that would stay with him for life. Just because you can record something doesn't mean you should. The difference between spontaneity and sloppiness is razor thin. Both songs, in their own way, became lessons carved into his memory. One taught him that stubbornness can ruin collaboration. The other showed him that freedom can be just as dangerous as control. But perhaps what makes these admissions so fascinating isn't just the songs themselves, it's that they reveal the human behind the myth. The Beatles were gods in the eyes of millions, but they were still four men trying to make art under impossible pressure. Paul, the perfectionist, often carried that burden more heavily than the rest. Every note mattered, every lyric had to mean something, and when it didn't, he took it personally. Even decades later, when the world calls him a genius, he still remembers the moments when genius failed him. When Paul talks about these songs now, there's no bitterness, just reflection. He can laugh about the hammer sound effects, the weird experiments, the studio tension that nearly broke the band. But beneath that humor, there's humility. He understands now what he didn't then, that the Beatles' greatness wasn't just in their music, but in their arguments, their mistakes, and their willingness to push and pull each other in uncomfortable directions. Maxwell's Silver Hammer and Wild Honey Pie might never top anyone's list of favorite Beatles songs, but in a strange way, they represent the cost of creativity, the risk every artist takes when they reach for something new. Paul's ability to admit that, to look back on his most famous work and say, "Yeah, that one didn't work," is what separates him from most legends. He's not afraid to expose the cracks in his own perfection. After all, the Beatles weren't flawless, and that's exactly why they mattered. They made mistakes, they argued, they chased bad ideas, and they learned from them. Paul McCartney's confessions don't tarnish the Beatles' legacy, they make it real again. They remind us that even the greatest artist in the world still listens back to some of his work and cringes a little. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't writing a hit, it's admitting that you wish one of your own songs had never seen the light of day. And for Paul, that honesty, even at 83, might be the most timeless melody he's ever shared. Next, the Obla Di, Obla Da was supposed to be a fun, carefree song about ordinary people living simple, happy lives. On the surface, it worked. Its upbeat rhythm and sing-along chorus made it one of the most recognizable Beatles tracks ever. It climbed the charts, filled radios around the world, and became an anthem of cheer. But for Paul McCartney, it was never something to celebrate. Behind every bounce of that piano, behind every "Life Goes On," was frustration, exhaustion, and regret. Paul has openly admitted in recent years that he can barely listen to it, not because it failed, but because it succeeded for all the wrong reasons. He wanted to write a ska-influenced pop tune, inspired by his Nigerian friend Jimmy Scott, who often used the phrase "Obla Di, Obla Da" as a casual saying. Paul thought it was catchy, a phrase that could bring a smile to people's faces. He imagined it as a lighthearted story about two people, Desmond and Molly, finding joy in simple things. But once they got into the studio, the joy disappeared. The recording sessions turned into a battlefield. Paul became obsessed with getting it right. Take after take, he demanded more precision, more bounce, more energy that never came. John Lennon hated it from the very beginning. He called it granny music. mocking Paul's taste for polished pop songs. George Harrison found the whole thing pointless and repetitive. Even Ringo Starr, who usually stayed patient through the band's tension, was visibly frustrated. Paul's perfectionism was becoming a curse. "We must have recorded it 100 times," he once said. And John's face got darker with every take. The song drained everyone. Instead of feeling like a team, the Beatles were starting to feel like session musicians working under Paul's control. But Paul refused to give up. Maybe he wanted a hit. Maybe he wanted to prove that he could still dominate the charts with something light and catchy. Or maybe he was just being stubborn, desperate to hold on to the formula that had made them legends. Whatever it was, Paul ignored everyone's complaints and pushed through. When Obla Di Obla Da finally came out and became a worldwide hit, Paul should have felt proud. Instead, he felt empty. John saw it as proof that Paul cared more about commercial success than artistic depth. It wasn't just a difference in taste, it was a crack in their friendship. "I forgot to make it meaningful," Paul later admitted. "It has no depth, no emotional weight. It's pleasant background noise. Every time he hears it playing in a grocery store or on the radio, he doesn't think of success. He thinks of the studio, of John's irritation, of how something so bright could leave such a bitter aftertaste." The song became the sound of a band drifting apart. For fans, it's nostalgia. For Paul, it's a reminder of the day he chose popularity over connection. Then came "Hello, Goodbye," another #1 hit, another regret. It was late 1967, right after the Beatles' manager Brian Epstein passed away. The band was shaken and uncertain. They needed stability, they needed a hit, and Paul, ever the responsible one, sat down to deliver exactly that. In one afternoon, he wrote the whole thing. Simple opposites strung together. Hello, goodbye, yes, no, why, I don't know. It wasn't profound or poetic. It was a catchy word game, and Paul knew it. He wasn't channeling inspiration, he was crafting a product. "I was under pressure," he admitted. "We needed a single." But even as he wrote it, he could tell it was hollow. The song had no emotional center, no story, nothing to say. Yet it had a perfect structure: verse, chorus, hook, and it sounded cheerful enough to work. It was musical comfort food. John Lennon saw right through it. He gave Paul his usual smirk and called it another of his songs, his tone sharp enough to cut. George Harrison barely cared, playing his part without interest. Even Ringo's drumming lacked enthusiasm. The energy that once defined their sessions was gone. They were professionals now, efficient, detached, tired. When the song hit #1, Paul smiled for the cameras, but deep down he felt the same dull ache that followed Obla Di, Obla Da. Hello, Goodbye wasn't bad. It was safe. It was designed to work. But that was the problem. Paul realized he had started writing to satisfy expectations, not emotions. The Beatles were supposed to be innovators, boundary breakers. And here he was, turning art into a formula. Even the promotional video showed their disconnect: bright costumes, fake smiles, movements that looked more rehearsed than real. They weren't the Beatles anymore. They were playing the role of the Beatles.
That song wouldn't be anything without that. You just came up with it. So that was the kind of pace we worked.
Paul's frustration later turned into guilt. He knew that with Hello, Goodbye, he had chosen comfort over creativity. It was the kind of song that everyone could hum along to, but nobody would ever feel deeply. It was a hit made from habit, not heart. Looking back, he said it represented the moment he started losing sight of why he made music in the first place. Success, once intoxicating, had become hollow. Every cheer felt quieter, every victory a little emptier. And then came the hardest truth of all: Let It Be. His masterpiece, his heartbreak. Paul wrote, "Let It Be," during one of the darkest times of his life. The Beatles were falling apart. The friendships that once felt unbreakable had turned into cold distance. In the middle of all that chaos, Paul had a dream. His late mother, Mary, appeared to him and told him everything would be all right, let it be. That phrase became the heart of the song. When he first played it, just piano and voice, it was haunting and beautiful.
He stays behind, writing 1,000 lines and then say
Pure emotion, no filters. It sounded like healing, like hope. But by the time it reached the world, it wasn't Paul's song anymore. It had been reshaped by others. layered with heavy orchestration and overproduction that drowned its soul. Producer Phil Spector, brought in by John, added choirs, strings, and horns, turning Paul's intimate prayer into a glossy, cinematic ballad. When Paul heard it, he said it made him sick. He begged to release his simpler version, but nobody listened. The band was collapsing, communication was gone, and his voice no longer carried weight. The song became a global anthem. It was played at weddings, funerals, protests, graduations. It became synonymous with comfort and closure. But for Paul, it symbolized loss, the loss of control, of unity, of the band that once changed the world. He wrote it to bring peace, yet it marked the end of everything peaceful in his life. "I can't listen to it without thinking of what it should have been," he admitted. For decades, Paul tried to reclaim it. He finally got his wish with the 2021 Let It Be reissue, stripping away Spector's layers and returning it to its original simplicity. But even then, it was too late. The version people loved, the overproduced one, was already etched into history. That's the one people know, the one that plays in their minds. And no matter how much Paul tries to fix it, he can't rewrite how the world received it. It's one of those cruel truths of art. The world doesn't always see what the artist sees. You can pour your soul into something, only to watch it become something else entirely. Paul's experience with Let It Be taught him the harshest lesson. Ownership ends the moment you share your work. The public turns it into what they need it to be, even if it breaks your heart.
I probably would choose Sgt. Peppermint.
Looking back, the songs Paul regrets most aren't necessarily bad. They just carry ghosts. Each one tells a story about pressure, pride, loss, and learning. Obla-di, Obla-da was the sound of trying too hard to please. Hello, Goodbye was the sound of playing it safe. And Let It Be was the sound of letting go too late. Together, they paint the portrait of an artist trapped between brilliance and burnout. Even today, when Paul hears these songs, he smiles for the audience. But behind that smile is a man who knows the price of perfection. He learned that not every hit brings happiness. Not every success means satisfaction. And sometimes, the songs that make you immortal are the same ones that remind you of your biggest mistakes. And maybe that's why his honesty matters so much now. Because when a legend like Paul McCartney admits that even the greatest can get it wrong, it reminds us that art is human. It's flawed, fragile, and endlessly fascinating. And that's what keeps it alive.